Hello and welcome to another video. Now, one of the holiday baking traditions that I really haven't had a chance to enjoy in a very, very long time is the tradition of the mince pie, or as we said where I grew up, the mincemeat pie. Funnily enough, it doesn't have any meat in it. All the recipes I found have been vegetarian, although I guess some recipes might use suet instead of butter, at least in some parts of the US. All the recipes that I've found more recently use butter. Now, mince pies are a mixture of candied and dried minced fruits, along with some minced fresh fruits, spices, sugar, a lot of that sort of thing. It's quite an amazing combination. If you've never tried one, you need to. Now, this is also a little bit complicated to make. So, if you are kind of new to working with large numbers of ingredients, don't let that intimidate you. Just understand we need to take this slowly. Do it in stages and don't get ahead of yourself. Although some pieces have a lot of ingredients in here, in some cases things can be substituted, and certainly you can play around with what you're using. So you can imagine a lot of people have their own recipes, their own family recipes. No two recipes I found online are alike, and although I have decided to use a couple of these recipes as a base. Even what I'm doing here is a mixture of several different recipes along with some of my own modifications. So, that's the mince pies. I hope you're as excited about this as I am, and I hope that not only are you having a great day right now, but thinking about making this makes it even better. So, next, I'm going to talk about the ingredients. I don't have all the ingredients on the board right now because there are a couple more yet, but we'll talk about all of this in a moment. So first, the ingredients for the crust. Now, we're going to make a basic crust. It is wheat flour, a bit of salt, some butter, and some cold water. So I have the water in the freezer, cooling down as much as I can without it freezing. That part we'll do first, then we'll come back and we'll make the filling while the dough stays in the refrigerator, and finally we'll bake this thing. Now for the filling, we will use more butter. We will also use some brandy. I chose an Italian brandy this time, but lots of different brandies would work. For spices, I have a teaspoon of cinnamon and half a teaspoon of cardamom and nutmeg. I have 2 apples, 2 oranges, about 100 grams or so of brown sugar, and then I have almonds, dried apricots, dried cranberries, raisins, figs, and of course this wonderful dried candied orange peel that I made in a previous video. So here I have 375 grams of flour, about 30 grams of sugar and half a teaspoon of salt, and 150 grams of butter. I'm going to go ahead and now whisk this together and then fold this in with a fork. You can use a, for example, dough hooks on a stand mixer or a hand mixer. That also works. And if you have a pastry knife, I guess we call it a pastry knife in the US, that would also work really well at this stage. I don't have any of those things, so I'm actually going to do this by hand. It's not going to be too bad. Now, if you have to do this by hand with a fork, it makes a lot of sense to start by cutting your butter into smaller bits, because what we're then going to do, and it's going to take a bit of work, is we're basically going to use the fork to force the butter and flour and sugar together. You could even use your hand like this. That would work, but it's going to take a lot of time and effort. So do yourself a favor and start by cutting the butter into small pieces, and then from there you can work it in with your hands or with a fork. Now, I ended up hand kneading this at this point, and hands actually work really well. And you'll eventually end up with a consistency where it's very even, and if you crumple it together, you get this sort of like powdery ball that form. And when this is nice and even, then we're ready to start kneading in a little bit of water at a time. And we'll keep doing this until we get a soft dough. Now, if you want a really flaky dough, then you probably will need to do it differently, but we're just going for kind of a standard pie crust at this point. So eventually, we end up with a relatively soft and pliable dough. You don't want to over-knead it, but this is basically where it's at. Next, I'm going to wrap this in plastic wrap, and I'm going to put it in the refrigerator while I work on the filling. So I've measured out 60 milliliters of brandy. We'll use this. I'm now going to grate. Both of these apples, and I'll slice these oranges in half so I can juice them. I'm also going to chop the larger dried fruit, so that means apricots and figs, and I'll chop I'll chop the almonds as well. So I'll do that. I'll also chop the candied peel, and I'll be back when all of these have been reduced to small pieces. And so here we have the ingredients for the filling. We have about 60 to 70 grams of butter. I think I have about 70 there. All of the dried fruit nicely reduced into small pieces. I've chopped the nuts a little bit finer, since obviously they will not break down the same way the fruit does. Here are the two apples. They're ground or grated. They're going to brown a bit while we're waiting. It's not the end of the world. And we have the brown sugar, the spices, the juice of 1.5 oranges, and the brandy. So what we're going to do is we're going to start melting this butter, and we'll combine it with some other these orange juice and the brown sugar and the spices, and then we'll add everything else. Now, as the butter is starting to melt, I'm going to add my spices and the brown sugar. And I'm going to start to stir this together. And then into this I will add the orange juice. So now this is all melted. We will pour in the orange juice and stir it all together. What's that? Something here did not. A piece of orange, let's get that out. And as soon as this starts to simmer, we will add the apples. In fact, yeah, now it's starting to simmer. So we will add the apples. And then all the dried fruits and nuts. In fact, I'm going to do that off camera. And then from that point, I'll just add the brandy on top. So I've added all the fruits and nuts, stir it up a little bit, pour in the brandy, and basically we're going to stir this so that the liquid gets absorbed by these dried fruits and stuff. That'll take just a couple minutes, and then I will be back. And here we have our mince pie filling. I'm now going to take this off the heat and let it cool, and we'll go ahead and prepare a pie crust. Now, the next step is to roll out the pie crust, and one problem that you may face is that having let this sit in the refrigerator, it will be a lot harder. So this is because the butter forms a major part of the dough, and it is temperature sensitive. So what I would recommend is just roll it out slowly, carefully, until you get a nice big sheet, and then we'll go from there. Sometimes I like to do it on baking paper like this, but you don't really have to. You could do it on a possibly slightly floured board, or yeah, something. So I've taken about 2/3 of the dough and I've rolled it out, and now I think I have enough. I'm going to prepare my pie tin by rubbing some butter around on it. You can use a paper towel. Of course, in the US, we used to use like the butter wrappers themselves. But this is basically to keep the pie crust from sticking as it bakes. So from here, what we'll do is put it over the top and try to center it. The little pieces that are not quite full, we can tear off bits around the edges and kind of mend. And then we will tear them off just a little bit above. This will become obvious why afterwards. As this is, and if there are areas that aren't quite up, then we'll just add a little bit of stuff here to so then the next thing is I will roll out the top, and then I will do the filling. So now I've added the what we call mincemeat, I guess, to the pie. And now I think I have this big enough. If we don't, we'll just have to manage. I'm going to go ahead and put the top on. So I've rolled out the top relatively thin. And it's going to be just a little bit small in places, but we'll manage. And then I'm going to go ahead and close this pie. And then we'll bake it at like 180 or so for about 20 minutes. It's like 370. And then it should be good. Then we'll be ready for the taste test. So what we're going to do here is we're going to find the areas where we have a lot extra. I'm just going to tear a little bit off. I'm going to press it on kind of lightly into the areas where we just don't have nearly enough. It's not going to be the most pretty pie in the world, but it will end up doing very nicely. It's a little difficult baking when you are in a foreign country because things like, baking pans tend to be a little bit different, and sizing can be a little bit difficult. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and just fold these over into kind of a seal. We don't want to fully seal it perfectly, so if there are areas which are not quite matching, that's okay. Of course, for a fancier party, that would be a little bit different. Maybe I'd try to find some way of cutting a pattern that would match, but this will be fine. Then I'm going to take a knife and I'm just going to cut a couple of holes like this in the top so that it doesn't balloon up, and then this will go in the oven as soon as the preheating's done. So for serving, normally the first piece or two that you take out of a pie is going to be really hard. So what I've actually done is I've cut a few small slivers out, and now I can cut a piece to actually serve. So you can cut a piece just about as big as you'd like to serve. I'm going to have a small one here because this is not dessert for dinner yet. And just lift it out with a spatula. This would be really, really good with like ice cream. But it's normally I've eaten it by itself. Now, just a note, you can add all kinds of dried fruit to this. You're not limited to the selection they've done here. You could also use a bunch of different kinds of candied fruit. But again, this is the variety that I've done here. So next up, we'll just go ahead and do a quick taste test, and then we'll be ready. And now for the taste test. The citrus flavors really come through. So do the apricots and the cranberries. This is really, really, really very nice. I will definitely keep this as a something that'll be a mainstay of my holiday cooking going forward. This is exactly what I remember from my childhood. Anyway, if you find this sort of content very useful, I would very much appreciate a subscribe, comment, like, and share. After all, that helps also YouTube know what you like, and will help you see more videos such as this. At any rate, thank you very much for watching, bon appetit, and see you next week.